Happy New Year and welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros, and today is going to be a solo conversation. And I'll be talking about something I've been thinking about lately, and perhaps something I'll write on, which is a framework for becoming smarter with Stoicism. That's the slogan way to put it. It's really about how to develop prudence or intelligence with Stoicism or as a Stoic. Something Michael and I are fundamentally interested in are practical frameworks and training strategies for becoming a better Stoic, which is really about, even if you're not a strict Stoic, really about becoming more excellent. And that's something that many philosophical schools would have aimed at, especially the Greco-Roman ones. And a part of that project is, of course, this project of human flourishing, pursuing happiness, is developing virtue. It's living as an excellent human being. These are slightly different ways of getting at the same thing. And it's very common to break down virtue into the four cardinal virtues. We have courage, moderation or self-discipline, prudence or intelligence, and then justice. Michael and I did a series on the ways in which the Stoics have broke those virtues down further, and I'll follow that tradition today. So there's a work by the Stoic Arius Didymus. He was in fact one of the advisors to the Emperor Augustus. It's Octavian, called The Epitome of Stoic Ethics. There's a decent amount here. It's not terribly long, and perhaps not too many surprises for people familiar with Stoicism, but it does have an excellent breakdown and definitions of the four cardinal virtues in addition to their parts, whether you think of them as subcomponents, sub-virtues, whatever. So let's talk through intelligence and think through, how could you develop a program to become more intelligent? So just off the bat, what does that mean? What does that mean for the Stoics? Intelligence, that's how this term is translated by Arthur J. Pomeroy in my version of The Epitome of Stoic Ethics. You'll also see prudence. That's a common translation, perhaps even more common than intelligence. And Arius Didymus writes that intelligence deals with appropriate acts. Yeah, prudence, perhaps a more common definition for this term, phronesis. You'll also see practical wisdom. I like intelligence because it connects to the Stoic view, of course, as seeing, as seeing the world as fundamentally intelligent. Nature has its own intelligence, and one's personal intelligence in some ways should mirror that or be a microcosm of nature's intelligence. Intelligence, the definition, it deals with appropriate acts, and the aspects of intelligence are, that's a fairly abstract definition. You're thinking about how to choose appropriate acts, the ability to make excellent decisions. That's one way to think about it. Practical wisdom and prudence here are useful. It has several parts. Pomeroy talks about soundness of judgment, circumspection, shrewdness, sensibleness, soundness of aim, and ingenuity. Let's go through each of these and then imagine, if you had a week, how could you develop each of these aspects of intelligence? All right, for that first week, we're going to be looking at sound judgment, a knowledge of what sort of things to do and how to do them well so you will act expediently. This term is also translated as good counsel, literally the capacity to deliberate well. It's the foundation of practical intelligence, knowing what to do and how to do it. Seneca has this nice metaphor in his piece of, standing before a council of mentors, a hypothetical, if you will, and being able to justify yourself well, being able to speak through your decisions and make an account of your behavior and thought in a way that would earn the respect of your mentors. And sound judgment, good counsel, I think, is if you're able to master this sub-virtue, I think that's an essential part of being able to do that exercise well. The word expedient here, so the definition was a direct quote from Pomeroy, means purposeful, or it points to an action that truly serves your aim, action that's practical, apt, well fitted to the situation. If you have sound judgment, you don't just have good intentions. You know how to bring those intentions about. You're able to transform a vision into undertaking. One way to think about each of these sub-virtues is first taking stock of whether you've developed it, and then thinking through, okay, what are different exercises or ways I could practice it throughout the week. So one way to potentially do this, if you wanted to develop intelligence in 6 weeks, work on Stoic intelligence in 6 weeks, would be to take stock at the beginning of each week for the sub-virtue, and then at the very end, see how far you've made progress. So the question here is, if you're developing sound judgment, what are the signs of progress? Some potential signs. You deliberate less anxiously because you trust your capacity to reason well. You more readily distinguish between situations where you can rely on your own counsel and those where you should seek another's expertise. Your actions consistently achieve what you intended them to achieve. And perhaps others begin to seek your counsel in your domain as well. Whatever domain you've chosen. And I think that's another point here, is that these virtues are so large, you want to be able to, in some sense, of course, you want to be able to exemplify them in every single aspect of your life. But often it's useful to pick a single domain to master, whether that's personal logistics, your career, school, sport, your craft, whatever it may be. So when I'm talking about a domain here, I do think it's often useful, certainly I find it useful to, instead of thinking about, how can I develop sound judgment over the week, being a little more precise, how can I develop sound judgment in my career, in my exercise, what have you. Cool. So some exercises for developing soundness of judgment. One, think of it almost as tracing your success. Think of a recent action that achieved what you intended. How were you able to do that? What was the skill you have that enabled purposeful action? What knowledge or experience informed your judgments? You can write this out or just think through it. The idea would be to make explicit the structure of your good counsel so you can recognize it and repeat it. Another exercise, the flip side of that, trace a failure. Recall a recent action that did not achieve what you intended, a place where your judgment failed. What happened? What did you misidentify? What did you want to do but fail to do. And be clear about the distinction between what's up to you and what's not. And also the distinction between what to do and how to do it. Because one could make failures at each of these levels. Of course, after you've traced a failure, you want to never repeat it. Another exercise or matter to reflect on throughout the day is thinking about when you can trust your own counsel, your own thinking, and when you can't. Essentially identifying decisions where you can deliberate well, places where you are uncertain, and then finally places where you know you lack the knowledge to judge well. And then decisions where there's some uncertainty, and then thinking through how can you reduce the amount of uncertainty. Can you look at other sources of information, run experiments, in the broadest sense, I mean. Ask someone else. The related test or exercise comes from Seneca. The counsel test. Before acting on any significant judgment in your domain, pause and ask, if someone I respect asked me to explain why this is the right course and how I would execute it, could I give a satisfying answer? If not, refine your thinking. Reflect on what you can say before you reflect on what to say before you can. And the last kind of exercise is just taking note of the judgments you're making and whether or not they're correct. You can do this through writing, of course, through some other forms of... You can do this explicitly, or you can simply train your attention, of course, to ensure that you are recognizing when you're making excellent decisions in places where you're missing the mark. This could look like being explicit about the decisions, the important decisions you're making, writing those down. Perhaps a nightly review type exercise or meditation, thinking about what happened lately and paying special attention to whether you exemplified soundness of judgment. Cool, so that's soundness of judgment. The next sub-virtue, circumspection. Michael and I call this view, sort of getting a good view of what's going on and then being able to act on it. Circumspection, I suppose, is not a word we use as often. It's knowledge of what marks off and summarizes what is still in process and what is completed. One must say it sounds rather like a matter of logistics, or the Stoics encouraging you to be a good product manager. Perhaps there's something to that. But I think in the right way, this virtue is somewhat energizing. You could think, what does life look like without this virtue? Is one way to come at it. I think without circumspection, without having a good view, we act on an out-of-date picture of the world. Stale assessments, treating open situations as closed or closed situations as open, and waste effort on what's already wrapped up or neglect what still requires our engagement. So in a way, circumspection is all about keeping our perception current. Knowing what's in process, knowing what is completed. It's a way of directing our attention to what is in process and what matters. So it's not merely, administrative tracking or becoming an excellent product manager. It's about seeing clearly what's in flux and what's finished and no longer relevant. So if the first week's about sound judgment, coming to good decisions, circumspection is about knowing where to apply that decision-making ability, knowing when and where to reflect. So what are the signs of progress here? If you have excellent circumspection, you should less often be surprised, in the sense that you'll not experience the sensation that a situation has changed without you realizing it. And you won't revisit decisions that are already settled. You perceive more quickly when a situation has shifted from open to closed. And your sense of what requires action and what does not will be more accurate. And if you're thinking about a domain where you're working with others, you'll also be able to direct others well, in the sense that you'll be able to see when perhaps someone's spinning their wheels on an issue that's effectively closed, and point them towards something that's a little more productive, perhaps. So some exercises for this sub-virtue then. One is making an inventory of, what are the open and closed issues in your life? Where are decisions that are really closed that you just keep on revisiting for no reason at all? Alternatively, what are some things that are still open where perhaps there's some amount of uncertainty that you can take steps to decrease, tying this into sound judgment. You won't be able to categorize everything. Of course, sometimes there are places where it's not clear whether a given situation is closed or not, or we have a nagging sense that something that appears to be closed, there's something more there. There's something else to it. Maybe we miss something. Don't completely ignore those intuitions. So it's fine if not everything fits into, say, an open or closed bucket. Part of developing the skill, of course, of circumspection is getting better at being able to discriminate between the two. And no one's going to be able to do that perfectly immediately. I think zooming into this, another kind of exercise would be identifying issues in your life that are actually stale. In particular, it's maybe not even an issue, but where's some place where you're acting on an out-of-date understanding of what's going on? What's something that you notice changed that you failed to perceive? And how can you update your assessment of the situation and keep your eyes open? I think the examples here are, of course, the examples that come most easily to mind are things related to product management or working on a team with other people, where you got surprised by some change of direction in a given project. But also in our personal life, I think there's the example of being in a relationship with someone, whether it's a spouse or friend or something like this, and you coast for some period of time and it appears to you that nothing's changed, but then a few months later you realize something fundamentally shifted, and it shifted before you realized it. I think that's the kind of thing you're trying to identify here. You don't want to be in that situation. Another kind of example might be if you have a given skill that you haven't exercised as much, and then find yourself needing it down the line, and you become worse at it. That certainly does happen. That does happen without realizing it until you're forced to perform. Another kind of exercise here, being able to perceive a matter that is moving from open to closed, wrapping up a project, wrapping up a decision, taking stock of what's going on and being able to do that quickly. And perhaps the most useful kind of exercise here is taking an audit of your attention and taking stock of where you directed your attention. Did you give attention to matters that are still open and call for engagement? Or did you waste attention on things already closed? And of course, the last exercise worth mentioning, I'll mention at the end of each of these, is having that structured way to reflect, either through an evening reflection or meditation, or being able to internalize this sub-virtue in a way where you think through whether you're practicing circumspection. So at the end of the week, you might want to think through whether you've made progress. At the end of the week, take stock and Do you have a sense that you have a good view of what's going on, or a better view of, what's in flux in your life right now? Are you able to live with what's in process and the uncertainty of it all, and, reduce surprises as best as you can? All right, moving on to the next week. 6 weeks to become a smarter Stoic. This is Shrewdness. And this week you can practice Shrewdness, knowledge which is able to discover the appropriate act on the spot. This is all about quickness of mind, the capacity to see what's called for immediately without extended deliberation. Perhaps soundness of judgment involves carefully weighing options, being able to reflect well. Shrewdness is trained perception that recognizes the appropriate response in the moment. Just like that. One of my favorite stories from Epictetus is when he talks about Agrippinus. And Agrippinus is asked by Florus whether Florus should attend Nero's feast. Agrippinus responds that Florus should, but he will not. And then, of course, Florus responds, and of course, Florus asks, well, why don't you go? Why are you telling me that I should go, but you do not? And Agrippinus responds, because I did not even deliberate about the matter. That's shrewdness in action. In our podcast on this, I also think of a memory of a coworker at an event. All of us were sort of standing in a circle at a park, and a homeless person was going by like 50 feet away or so and having issues with their bike. And I think some of us saw this person a little earlier than others, but this friend, as soon as they saw that person going by, they immediately walked over and started helping them. They didn't deliberate. They just saw someone who they could help because of their skills that already existed. Being able to fix a bike, not everyone could do that. And acted without hesitation, unlike others of us in that circle. I like how ordinary that example is too. But I think if one was able to live a life of making those sorts of decisions, that would be an awesome thing indeed. Just those kinds of decisions. So what are the signs of progress here? You should notice less freezing or hesitation. And also see that your immediate responses they prove to be the right ones on reflection. Often you'll be reflecting on the day and think, oh, I acted in a knee-jerk response or fashion here. That was silly. But success really is being able to have knee-jerk responses that are just correct. So you want to be doing that more often. So you'll see situations that required perhaps longer reflection now needing less. And I think you'll also see inappropriate courses not occurring in your mind as often. If you think about a vice, wasting time on social media, what have you, something really basic like that. One way to become more shrewd is these sorts of mistakes, vices, just don't appear in your calculus. They're not open paths to you. If you're shrewd, you've got a better set of paths to choose from, and that's why you're able to make decisions much more quickly. So that's what progress looks like. Think about a domain where you want to become more shrewd and practice. Some ways to practice. Think through principles that will guide your decisions and revert to those principles quickly. Keep them in mind. And you want to choose ones that can actually guide your decisions well, of course. And this can be quite easy if you're working on, say, an anger issue or perhaps becoming nervous in a specific situation. Bringing that principle to mind, and perhaps that principle can have some amount of force to help you make a better decision that points away from anger or anxiety. Perhaps also even good practical rules of thumb for a skill you're trying to develop. So that's one way to become more shrewd. If someone needs help, I'll help them. Even really basic principles like this could serve you well. Another kind of exercise that's always useful and something we'll see again is tracking where are you able to make those decisions immediately that prove to be correct. Try to recreate that ability, take it to another domain. Alternatively, where are the places in your life where you're responding poorly? Places where you hesitated perhaps and maybe made the right decision in the end, but it's a little slow. What's missing? Is it what's really driving that hesitation, as it were? Can you just get rid of that, or is there something more substantive there? Because of course sometimes we ought to hesitate. So this is perhaps even one of sub-virtue that's essential, but you can see how it has more risks in its practice perhaps than the earlier two, because you might think you're becoming shrewd when really you're becoming foolish faster. That is a risk here that you should be mindful of. Another kind of exercise here that's very useful is rehearsal or pre-rehearsal. Thinking of situations that you're likely to face throughout the day, and then the decision you will make when that situation arises. Determine what the appropriate action would be so that you're preloaded, as it were, with the right course. So if that situation does arise in the way that you think it will, you make the right decision. The last sorts of exercise I want to mention here is perhaps not even an exercise, but a way to direct your efforts would be to think about situations where you can quickly make decisions that are lower stakes. So physical skills here, developing a physical skill is a useful analogy. Where are places you can actually train, maybe even social conversation, and that's sort of a lighter fare, if you will. See how you can get feedback on what you're telling other people relatively quickly, how you're interacting with people, how the social situation's going. But if you think about training a martial art or something like this, it's a place where you can get many strikes in, some low pressure sparring in multiple times, and work on making quick decisions. Many of them will be mistakes, but see if you can sort of fine tune yourself to act quickly, keep up the pace, as it were, and be moving in the right direction, making fewer mistakes. So to the extent that you can, I think if you can find something like that in your domain, I think that will really push you towards becoming more shrewd. You want to be like the chess master who sees immediately how the board is arranged and what the next move is, because you've seen so many arrangements before. And that's something everyone can do. Nearly everyone, at any rate. And that's something anyone dedicated enough, who has put enough time into their domain, can do. Excellent. Week 4, Sensibleness. A knowledge of what is worse and what is better. So this is not the exact same as knowing that courage is good and cowardice is bad. It's the trained perception that's able to discern which of the several decent options is better and which is worse. One way to cut it is you're able to see the options in finer detail. You have evaluative depth that enables better choices among the different paths, different options. And you're just really more precise in thought here. Now, someone who's sensible is able to recognize the relevant considerations, and be the person who others think of as thoughtful, because they're able to perhaps notice what's good or bad about different situations and act accordingly. Signs of progress here is you're able to distinguish changes in quality that you previously missed. And this here, I mean quality that really matters, what's essentially good or bad. And you can articulate why one option is better than the other, not merely that it is. Your choices among competing goods are consistently excellent, and you can see that they are perhaps even better than options that might be adequate or reasonable. And you're able to develop a vocabulary for the distinctions that matter in your domain. One way to see it is, what does excellent look like in my domain, and can I articulate that clearly in detail? So I think that would be the first practice, coming up with some sort of evaluative spectrum or picture of excellence where you're able to describe what good and bad look like in concrete terms, and then identify the gradations between the two. What are the different dimensions in which a decision can be good or bad? I think this is excellent for practical skills, especially for thinking about trade-offs. And I think you're training, here you're just training your perceptions to see the full spectrum. Another kind of exercise is look at cases. Another kind of exercise is looking at direct comparisons, just doing a direct comparison. If you want to improve writing, for example, the craft of writing, take a piece that is excellent and try to understand it, what makes it good, and compare that against some other piece, your own writing perhaps, and see how it fares, what's missing. Try to be precise as you can here. Other ways to practice this are sort of identifying trade-offs between different decisions. I think that's, you're looking at different dimensions in which things may be good or bad. But there is also the risk that one gets too hung up on trade-offs. Of course, there always are going to be trade-offs, but sometimes there are ways we can find a better way, cut through, slice the Gordian knot, as it were, which is just to say, if we're deciding between A and B, perhaps there's always some better option C that we could recognize. I think that's what makes so many people sensible, is that they're able to see that option where others cannot. And perhaps that's another way in which you could recognize your progress. You take that decision instead of choosing B, even though B is better than A, you've recognized C. That's week 4, sensibleness. Moving on to week 5, soundness of aim, a knowledge which is able to hit the target in each case. This is accurate targeting, the capacity to hit what you're aiming at. It's related to sound judgment, I believe. And it's really the disposition to select and aim well and continue to travel toward it. And you certainly see how these sub-virtues are connected. This one especially, I think, requires the others to work well. In order to move towards the practical aim in a particular situation, you need to be able to make good decisions, understand what's going on, have a good view. Ideally, be able to make progress by making decisions quickly, and then also act with the required sensibility. And perhaps this is an especially good one to come later in the program, as it were, because signs of progress are also going to be signs of progress in the other sub-virtues. So your actions are more consistently able to achieve what you intend them to achieve. You more readily identify when an action has drifted from its target, and you're clearer about what you're aiming at. And your misses are instructive. Those would be some signs of progress. You're able to... Another sign of progress perhaps is satisfaction. The satisfaction that you are moving in the right direction. And that includes both the judgment that the direction you've chosen is correct, and of course the other judgment that you are moving toward it and doing your best to do so, which is all one can hope for in the end. And I think that's a nice example of how the Stoics see cognition influencing our emotional life. If we have soundness of aim, that can bring about tranquility because we're happy with the direction of our life, which is certainly something not everyone can say, and certainly something all of us are going to struggle with. So what are some of the exercises here? The first is just naming the target. What are you aiming at? What's the goal, North Star of your actions? Again, focusing on a specific domain. Clarity, precision, all good things here. And being able to recognize places in the past where you've made a hit, as it were. When did you hit the target? What enabled that? What made that target a good one? And how can you continue along the same path? And of course, the reverse exercise here is also useful. Being able to trace a miss. Did you choose the wrong target? Did you choose the right one but fall short? What was it? What exactly happened here? And perhaps, and this is where attention is so important here. The exercise, the daily exercise, is checking in on where you're going. What's happening? Are you actually implementing soundness of aim in your everyday thoughts and actions? If you can do that multiple times a day, that could be a force for good in your life, certainly. And then taking time to reflect on the path of your day, path of your week, and longer time scales, of course, also. How your years are developing. Not everything can be done in a day, a week. Many projects take years. And that just makes ensuring that you've chosen the right projects and know how to complete them all that more important. All right, last one, week 6, ingenuity. A knowledge which is able to discover a way out of difficulties. Also think of it as relentlessness or resourcefulness. The capacity to find solutions where the path forward is blocked. The obstacle is the way. What I like about this, the presence of this as a sub-virtue, is that this is a cognitive virtue. It's ability to discover a way out, not merely endure difficulty. The Stoics did distinguish ingenuity from endurance and perseverance. When obstacles arise, it's bravery that enables us to bear it. But ingenuity asks, is there a way through? Is there a way around, a way out of this difficulty that you've not seen yet? It's creative. Creative, practical reasoning under constraint. And perhaps that's why ingenuity is a better word, actually, than relentlessness. Resourcefulness also works well, I think. If you're resourceful, you can choose the right path, make the right move with what's available. All right, what are the signs of progress here? If you are developing ingenuity, you should notice when you're blocked. You can generate more possible solutions before just concluding that none exist. You don't get stuck. And you can distinguish more readily between difficulties that require creative solutions and those that don't. I think there's certainly a mistake of ingenuity where some people are, trying to get creative where they don't need to. That's not what ingenuity is about. That's not being resourceful, let alone expedient. I think another sign of progress would be your solutions are apt. They're fitted to the specific difficulty at hand. And finally, you draw on the resources, whether that's skills, relationships, tools that perhaps you've overlooked. You can look back on your week and realize, I made an excellent use of this resource here. Some exercise to practice this ingenuity. Take an inventory of difficulties you're facing. And for each, noting whether you found a way through, whether you're still searching, or whether you should conclude that no way exists and it's endurance that's required. You also want to be honest here about whether you may have given up searching prematurely. Another kind of exercise is thinking of constraints not as obstacles to be removed, but almost thinking of them as, what do they make possible? What paths become possible given this constraint? Obstacles often open up new possibilities. The obstacle is the way. The impediment to action advances action. Reframe constraints, adversity in that way, instead of thinking of it necessarily as a blocker. Another kind of exercise is thinking about your resources. What do you have that you're not fully listing? This shouldn't just be thought of as external resources, of course, but think of skills you have, character traits, in addition to people you could talk to, tools you have but aren't using, or even time you could reallocate. Choose an underused resource and see if it can apply to any of the difficulties you've identified. And I think another kind of exercise is thinking of that alternative path. Where can you cut through the Gordian knot, as it were? What's that option you're not thinking of yet for a given difficulty you're facing? Here's where creativity can really pay off. Thanks for listening to all this. Perhaps got a bit long and a little longer than I anticipated, to be honest, but that would be a sketch of becoming more intelligent by practicing the sub-virtues of intelligence, and a sketch of how to make those a little bit more concrete. Because the virtues, of course, they're abstract things that can show up in so many different, in a way they're exceptionally simple, but they can apply to so many different situations. And developing a simple disposition like prudence is a complex matter, I believe. So that's a sketch of one way in which you could break down the virtue of prudence, intelligence, phronesis, by focusing on the sub-virtue, a given sub-virtue, one a week, and thinking about what are the markers of progress for that sub-virtue, and what are different exercises you can do throughout the day to achieve it. Let me know what you think about this. This is probably something we'll make a little more concrete, more systematic in the letter, and of course the Stoa app as well. We do have a outstanding course on the on each of the Stoic virtues, and each of them break down the sub-virtues into bite-sized lessons and exercises. So we do have a week-long course for each. But at this new year, I thought it might be interesting to think through a skill like this, a virtue like this, and show you all how I would think about developing a skill like this in a short period of time. Of course, you can't expect to be sage at the end, but I do think would be possible to make serious progress here. Let's end with a final word from Seneca. Let's end with some words from Seneca. For whatever we do ought to be in harmony with this. No man can set in order the details unless he has already set before himself the chief purpose of his life. The artist may have his colors all prepared, but he cannot produce a likeness unless he has already made up his mind what he wishes to paint. That's from Moral Letter 71. Thanks for listening.